Oh, wonderful. Okay, I'll start with a poem and then I'll dive into the introduction. This is a poem by May Sarton at 80. It's about that time of night when we wake up, even if we don't want to, in reflection and worry and sometimes loneliness. But something else could sometimes happen in the middle of the night, too. And this is what she says. In the middle of the night, my bedroom washed in moonlight, and outside, the faint hushing of an ebbing tide, I see Venus close to the waning moon. I hear the bubbling hoot of a playful owl. Heroes' purrs ripple under my hand, and all this is bathed in the scent of roses by my bed, where there are always books and flowers. In the middle of the night, the bliss of being alive.
Wow.
So on that note, thank you, Gil. I am so honored to be interviewing Jeremy Taylor for our Elder Interview Series, and I'd like to begin by introducing him to our audience, though it sounds like he needs no introduction. Jeremy Taylor is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. He holds a Doctor of Ministry degree from the University of Creation Spirituality and an honorary Doctor of Sacred Theology degree from Star King School for the Ministry. He is also a founding member and past president of the International Association for the Study of Dreams. Jeremy has worked with dreams for over 40 years, pioneering some truly remarkable innovations in dream work techniques. He appears regularly on local, regional, and national TV and radio. He has taught at the schools and seminaries of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley for over 4 decades, as well as a wide variety of colleges and universities in the San Francisco Bay Area. His life and his work blend deep spirituality, a powerful social conscience, and a Jungian perspective on the human psyche. Finally, Jeremy has written 4 books integrating dream symbolism, mythology, and archetypal psychology. They are The Wisdom of Your Dreams, Dream Work, Where People Fly and Water Runs Uphill, and The Living Labyrinth. He has also been working in the graphic novel format, attempting to bring ideas of creation spirituality to a wider and younger audience, and perhaps we'll see some of that today. Personally speaking, I've been blessed to be in Jeremy's classes at the University of Creation Spirituality and the Chaplaincy Institute, and as a clinical psychologist, did dream work with clients for 3 decades, so I'm not a novice, and I have seen firsthand Jeremy's encyclopedic grasp of mythology, archetypes, dream symbols, and the use of dreams in personal growth. At 75, Jeremy is still diving deeply into the archetypal collective unconscious for wisdom and personal growth. So if that's not enough, and with no more ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Dr. Jeremy Taylor to Creation Spirituality Program Interviews. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
With the time we have today, I'd like to explore 4 areas of your life and work. Your work with dreams, the arc of your personal life, your own experience of aging, and the wisdom you've acquired over a lifetime. So let's start with your dreams. How did you get interested in dream work? I mean, how did a UU minister become a world-class expert in dreams?
The timing was reversed. I became, blush, choke, a world-class expert on dreams before I became a UU minister.
Oh, okay.
I was doing the work from a funny kind of community organizing political backdoor here in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first piece of organized group dream work that I did was in the context of a seminar, a retraining seminar for volunteers at a service committee project in Emeryville, which is on the east side of the bay, nestled like a little cancer between Oakland and Berkeley. It's an incredibly corrupt place. When Earl Warren got on the Supreme Court, he said that Emeryville was the most corrupt community in California.
Wow.
And he had places like Indio and Sacramento and any number of other places to choose from. And what happened was that it became very clear that one of the only ways to facilitate actual reliable change in that community was to address the question of unconscious projection head on and that the most immediate and interesting and engaging way to do that was to get people to share their dreams at a very gross level, in which the dream literally included some kind of racial sentiment, fear and unrest and whatnot, and to explore those dreams from the point of view that the dream itself is a tissue of projection, that amongst the multiple meanings that always exist in every dream, the Gestalt level is always present. It isn't the only story, but it is always present. So that all of those characters who feel utterly like not me and threatening and dangerous are in fact aspects of my own being, which I am experiencing in the dream world as not me, in the same way I experience them as not me in the waking world. So that if insight can be generated at the level of the Gestalt experience of the dream, behaviors in the waking world change almost 100% of the time for the better and stay changed, that it's a transformation of consciousness itself.
Wow.
And by interest, I've been vastly interested in dreams for as long as I can remember. And one of my earliest vivid memories is having a dream populated by Walt Disney cartoon characters, very exciting dream, and getting up and dashing downstairs to tell the dream to my grandmother, who I sincerely believed knew everything. I thought I projected the wisdom of the all-wise on her, and she had hooks to hang it on. And when I told her the dream, she was cooking breakfast, and the only thing I can remember is that I stood lower than the knobs on the propane stove where she was cooking breakfast. So I think I maybe 4.5, 5, something like that.
Wow.
And I told her the dream, and then I asked her what it meant, and she turned around and looked at me and beamed and said, "Oh, honey, it's a dream. It doesn't mean anything." And I was so shocked. In some sense, I'm still riding on the distressing conclusion that I came to at that moment was, whatever the expletive was at age 5, OMG, she's this wonderful person who I love, who loves me and knows all this stuff. But if she's wrong about this, what else is she wrong about?
And she had to be wrong. In your guts, you knew that.
I didn't know what the dream meant, but I knew it meant something, and I knew it was important. And for her to blithely toss it aside destroyed my inappropriate projection of all wisdom on her. And in that moment, I decided, gulp, I'm going to have to take responsibility for figuring out what's true, particularly in the unseen world.
Wow.
The only regular glimpse of which we get is in dreams. I'm going to have to do that myself.
What an incredible formative experience.
As I say, I am who I am today in large measure because of that dream and because of the shocked response that her comment led me to.
Some of our betrayals are the most profound experiences of all.
Yes.
So what have you learned most deeply about dreams over 40 and 50 years of thinking about them?
Right. Well, if you go all the way back, it's more like 70 years. So.
70 years, yeah. I was thinking professionally, but the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. Professionally, I worked up enough nerve to start asking for money in my early 20s. And as you mentioned, I'm 75, I'm in my 75th year. And so the math is inescapable. And what I have learned is fairly simple, that all dreams come in the service of health and wholeness, emphasis on the all, even the worst gut-wrenching, sweat-popping nightmare comes ultimately in the service of health and wholeness and speaks a universal language. One of the reasons I'm so drawn to Carl Jung is that he gives us contemporary language for talking about the recurrent patterns of meaning and energy exchange that show up in the dream world. He calls them archetypes of the collective unconscious. And one of the things that I find so interesting is that when he says the gods have become diseases, he's not joking. That's a very serious comment, that these patterns, which he calls archetypes, were initially conceived by us as divine figures. And so one of the things that I know is true, and it seems to me that anybody who looks at the question honestly has to come to the same conclusion, is that this conversation that we human beings have about the deeper meanings and implications of our dreams is the oldest unbroken spiritual conversation that we have engaged in as a species. And that is as true now as it was back, my guess is, looking at the archaeological evidence, even before we evolved into so-called Homo sapiens. I've also come to the conclusion that it is unbelievable arrogance for us to call ourselves Homo sapiens. Homo boobiensis sounds accurate. And we need, well, that we ignore these deep, shared, common human patterns at our peril, individually and collectively, which, as you mentioned, is one of the reasons I'm making graphic novels and comic books these days, is I'm trying to get this absolutely crucial information out into a world where people do not read stuff written unless it comes with pictures. Mm-hmm. 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 And my comics have been successfully translated into several different languages, and several of them have been hijacked, which is perhaps the sincerest form of flattery. I don't get any royalties, but
you get spiritual royalties.
Yeah. If you don't care who gets the credit, you can get a lot of things done.
Yeah. Well, dreams that are images, and you're drawing images, so it's really the same common language.
Yes, absolutely.
How has the dream world changed your life? How has it grown you?
Well, my wife and I have been together for more than 50 years. We got together in our early 20s, and we are the only ones who paired up at that age who are still paired. We ran around with a big crowd, and none of those people are still married to the people they were back then. And we both credit a lot of that to our continuing daily practice of sharing dreams with one another, because the dreams have given us both distant early warnings of situations in our lives and psyches which, had they been allowed to develop, I can only imagine would have become deal breakers.
Wow.
But since we were able to encounter them early enough with plausible deniability, I remembered this dream. I can't take full responsibility for it. And yes, some of the implications that come up as we talk together about it are very disturbing and embarrassing. Mm-hmm. But it's so much better to have this way of talking about it. I can talk about stuff that I didn't even know was there until I remembered the dream, and in our conversation, I realized what some of the implications were, which I was not conscious of when I was having the dream or when I was remembering it. So I would say the practice of pretty much daily dream work is responsible for us still being cheerfully and enthusiastically and excitedly together.
Oh, that's beautiful. And way better than acting out.
Yes, indeed. Not that there hasn't been any acting out, but we are both visibly and consciously aware of how much more there would have been if some of that steam pressure, to use a crude analogy, hadn't been valved off early by doing the dream work. And by being grateful to each other for the understandings that we have of one another that manifest in the projections on each other's dreams. It's also become my primary profession, and what literary career I have, not just in the discursive books about dreams, but the poetry and the fiction and the other stuff, is all dream informed. And so it has become this seemingly inexhaustible font of creative energy in my life. And one of the reasons I'm here is that I think Matt is absolutely right. That if you want to cultivate a conscious awareness of the presence of the divine in your life, then one of the best ways to do it is to pay attention to creation, to the vastness of nature and the cosmos on the one hand, and to our own and other people's creative expressions on the other. And if we do those two things simultaneously, a felt sense of the presence of the divine is a reliably predictable consequence.
Is there a most pivotal dream that you can remember that it informed you in this way?
Oh, there are so many. Recently, and it's sort of embarrassing because it's taken me so long to figure it out. I think it's always been true. But recently, I came to understand that the groups of people who show up in the dream world who are anonymous, who are unknown, like other people sitting around the card table, all the way to the Oakland Coliseum filled to the brim with anonymous crowds, that the appearance of anonymous figures in the dream world is a very reliable archetypal metaphor of the presence of the ancestors, the presence of the dead, and that I am now convinced that we all live our real, from the point of view of the clock and calendar world, immortal lives in an arena which Carl Jung calls the collective unconscious, and other cultures have given other names to: fairyland, the land of the dead, the land of the yet unborn. And that one of the things that characterizes the place where we live our real lives is that the apparent beginning and middle and end, from the perspective of the clock and calendar world, are all taking place simultaneously. And at this point, the only thing I can imagine, and I take imagination very seriously, the only thing I can imagine that takes full account of everything that I know and every experience that I've had is that when we die, the consciousness that we have cultivated over the period of a single physical life returns in some fashion or another to the dream world. And that when James Hillman, for instance, talks about soul making, and how if you don't put the energy into making a soul, you don't have one, I think it's a rather harsh metaphor for the same understanding.
Wow.
And that what we experience as the memory of our dreams when we're awake is the closest experience we have to the afterlife, which is afterlife only from the point of view of the clock and calendar world. It's the simultaneous, ever-present. Thich Nhat Hanh is calling it the eternal now these days. And I think it's a great phrase, that all our lives really happen in the eternal now, and that the main task, if you want to be conscious after death, the main task is to cultivate that consciousness to the point where it can survive in this environment of timelessness.
Wow.
And the dead seem to me to be easily divisible into at least three categories. One, the categories of the dead who failed to live up to their full potential when waking life presented them with psychospiritual problems, solvable problems, which they failed to solve, and they carry that sense of frustration with them into the afterlife. The easiest access to that understanding in Jung's work is the 7 Sermons for the Dead, which is an appendix in the Princeton University edition of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Interestingly enough, it isn't included in the British English language edition of Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
Huh.
And Ananelia Yaffe tells this story, I find it very amusing, that Jung is essentially a 19th century character, and he carries his 19th century sense into the world. And part of his 19th century sense is that America is all the way over on the other side of the ocean, and people don't pay that much attention. So the 7 Sermons can be published in the Princeton University.
Got it. Uh-huh.
And
yeah, that makes sense.
It won't be evidence that Europeans will use that he's simple-minded.
Jeremy, would you say that you have been lived by a particular archetype or myth or
yes,
fairy tale? How would you capture that?
Well, it isn't a sleeping dream, but it's a waking dream. Years ago, I was driving Kathy, my wife and life's partner, to the airport in San Francisco from our home in Marin. She was going to go on a nostalgic visit back to Niagara Falls where she was born, and she was going to look at the places where she had lived and all that intense life review stuff. And we were driving along on Highway 101 in Marin, and I got sideswiped by a motorhome that spun the car out across the 3 lanes and smashed us against the center guardrail, facing the traffic in the fast lane on a place called Wolf Grade. And there was a truck barreling toward us in the fast lane. I knew the truck was going to hit us. I did a quick calculation, and the bumper of the truck was higher than the bumper on my car. And I knew what was going to happen was that the truck was going to smash into the front of the car, was going to rip the engine off the engine mounts, and it was going to drive the steering wheel through my chest like a spear. And sure enough, it all happened, and it did rip the engine off the engine mounts, but it was not strong enough to drive the steering column through my chest. It simply rammed the steering wheel into me. So I had this grotesque smiley face bruise on my diaphragm that lasted for a long time. And in that moment, my life flashed before my eyes. And not only did my waking life flash before my eyes, my dreams flashed before my eyes as well. And I had this sudden understanding, oh, is that what this is all about? And the moment of impact drove the speech ripe, able to put into words understanding of what that was. but I have a vivid understanding of what it felt like to know what it was. And I think I'm still growing into being able to put words around it. Clearly, one of the archetypes that I have been acting out in the world is the archetype of the magician. And the closest parallel, I think, out of my ethnic heritage is Merlin. And Merlin's complicated magical relationship to historical, political, and military events is very much like my relationship to the big political and cultural events of my life, of our collective life. And that one of the things that knowing that alerts me to is the vulnerability to being seduced and abandoned by a student of mine. In the Merlin story, it's Vivian, it's Nimue, who learns all his magic and then traps him in the crystal cave. And that is a metaphoric, archetypal representation of a particular psycho-spiritual vulnerability that I have. And that has been very useful information.
I guess so.
There have been moments when I realized consciously, oh, I'm at one of those moments now.
How dangerous it was.
How dangerous it is. And how stepping away from it is not the most valuable coping strategy. That it's all a species of the psychospiritual problems that come up doing dream work with people one-to-one. My colleagues that I trust in the therapy business confess to me that they have the same experience, but it's not fashionable. To interact with our clients at the level of intimacy that dream work regularly brings us to means either the relationship continues and progresses or it ends. And if it continues and progresses, the chances that I'm going to fall in love with my clients and that my clients are going to fall in love with me is so high as to be inevitable.
That's the process of therapy too.
Yeah, it's all about transference and countertransference. And just because that's a danger, that's not a sufficient reason not to do the work.
Right.
Or to pretend that level of emotional energy has not been evoked. Because I think that level of emotional energy is one of the primary sources for the healing that sustained intimacy always generates.
Yeah, that's Eros. So how does aging play into this evolution of Jeremy Taylor and this time of life?
Well, again, to refer to dreams, which is my primary touchstone in all of this, I am seldom in my 75th year in the dream world physically. My dream body is a good deal younger. My consciousness is pretty much the same consciousness that I'm aware of having when I'm awake. But every once in a while, and I don't, that's not even the right way to put it. Constantly, and every once in a while, it bothers me how much of my dreaming I am still not able to remember. I know it's happening, but I can't remember it. And my curiosity about that increases with age rather than decreasing. And so the whole, for lack of better language, adventure that Matt invites us on out of the metaphor of creation spirituality is particularly valuable as we age, because there are so many wonderful benefits that come from creation spiritual practice that do not spring immediately out of the spiritual practices of other traditions. As a matter of fact, because I've been working with so many of my clients for so long, many of them started out as passionate, professional, spiritual leaders in other traditions, and who did not engage in the dream work for the purpose of having their relationship with the traditions that they've devoted their lives to evaporate. But in large measure, because of following creation spiritual paths, the limitations of their traditions that they have sincerely devoted their entire lives to become chafe on them more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of where do we find institutional connections that satisfy these needs becomes greater and greater. And my sense is that that's not, well, the fact that so many people dream about it leads me to believe that it's possible. But it's very hard. I cannot recommend that people hook up with Unitarian Universalist congregations in good conscience, because I don't know of any Unitarian Universalist congregations. There are a lot of wonderful congregations out there, but I don't know any of them which satisfy this particular level of spiritual search.
Yeah.
Nor do I know of any other institutions that do, including the bravely improvised services of the creation spiritual community. And that's, it's not a fashionable thing to say, particularly in the circle, but I think my commitment to answer the questions honestly is greater than my commitment to support the particular efforts of the creation spiritual community, even though I think they're all wonderful. Well, absolutely got my full support.
The answers come from such a deep place in you and in your dreams that it would be a betrayal of your own unfolding to go back into your head and talk dogma.
That's right. And I think that's true for everybody.
I agree.
I strongly suspect it's true for everybody in this electronic room. I don't think we would have agreed to meet this way if that were not so, whether we were consciously aware of that as an element in our decision making or not.
What is our work at this time, Jeremy?
Oh, whew. Well, in some sense, it's the same as it's always been. To become increasingly conscious of who we really are, and increasingly conscious of how well or ill we are at manifesting that in the world, individually and collectively. We live in a society where the individual side is easier to see, but I believe that one of the pitfalls of American life is separation from the collective. And it's another one of the reasons why I'm a dream worker, that in the dream world, my experience suggests that we really are one folk. And the best metaphor I can think of at this point out of the Western language is that we are all characters in God's dream. And that we exist in relation to the divine in exactly the same formal fashion that the seemingly separate characters in our remembered dreams exist in relation to our whole beings. What
so
you
God living through us? God lives through us in this way? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Or fails to.
If we fail to live it out.
Yes. Yes. And that everything is somehow directed toward that end, whether we are consciously cooperating with it or not. That's the universalist side of my tradition. I believe that we are so deeply connected to a single energy source that we can't see it, not because it is so distant, but because it is so close.
Yeah.
And that one of the things that dreams do is to allow us this double perspective of cosmic distance and personal awareness. I have literally bet my life on that proposition.
Wow. What about the prophetic aspect of dreams? How have you found them?
I would be willing to say from a theoretical point of view that there is a prophetic element, an experience of the future not yet manifested in every dream. In part because it's all there in the eternal now. So it's not too surprising that if consciousness is cultivated to the point of remembering more and more what this experience that we call dreaming is, that a lot of that is going to include memories of things that haven't happened yet.
That'll take your breath away.
Yeah, it's profoundly inimical to the unjustified claims that the rational materialist worldview makes to being the whole story. It's so clear that the rational materialist worldview is not the whole story. And yet we are so ferociously invited and intimidated into not going past that, that this work that we're doing right now is dangerous. There are places inside the continental US where local thought police could bust into anybody's room and use participation in this chat room as a charge of heresy. And fortunately, that's not the law of the land at the moment. It's one of the things that makes me very nervous about this rush to amend the Constitution to get rid of the Citizens United decision, because the easier the Constitution is to amend, the more likely it is that wild zealots whose interest is ultimately in limiting human possibility rather than expanding it will take advantage of the accessibility of amending the Constitution.
Yeah.
And we will lose 200 plus years of this brilliant experiment that the United States has turned out to be. And in terms of what we need to do, awareness of that problem at this moment, I think, is of immense importance. And I think we need to be able to talk to each other about it. And I think we need to be able to talk to each other about it, not just in political terms, because ultimately the politics are a shadow cast by the spiritual problem.
Yeah.
And it's why I believe that curiosity, really, seriously, that curiosity is the highest order spiritual emotion that we are capable of. And unfortunately, as you all know, you can talk from one end of the year to the next with various kinds of theologians, who will not celebrate curiosity as a primary spiritual value or experience.
Where has curiosity taken you that has been the most challenging or difficult to be Jeremy Taylor?
Yeah, well, it has dissolved my earlier certainties into a soup of existential possibility. Let me tell you a quick story, again, from the waking world, about my one and only face-to-face meeting with the Dalai Lama. I was up on the campus of the San Francisco Theological Seminary, which paradoxically is not in San Francisco at all. It's in Marin County in San Anselmo. And that outfit had invited the Dalai Lama to come and preach on tape. They were producing an archive of 20th century preaching, and he really got into it. And so he stayed in the recording studio a couple of hours longer than the schedule had said. And there were all these people gathering around outside, and it was very tense because the Chinese had announced essentially a price on the Dalai Lama's head. And so the Secret Service, who were in charge of protecting him, had declared the airspace over the seminary a no-fly zone. And there were all of these burly, from my point of view, undereducated young men in dark suits and sunglasses with high-powered rifles standing on the roofs of all the buildings. Wow. And a lot of the crowds who had come to see the Dalai Lama, in typical Marin County fashion, decided to enhance their experience with chemical additives.
Oops.
And several of them were Vietnam vets who were freaked out by the helicopters circling around the school. So there are all these people freaking out all over the place. And in the middle of that, I'm standing there thinking, you know, the only solid external spiritual principle that's still standing in the midst of them toppling as a result of my examinations and personal experience is thou shalt not kill. And I'd been chewing on that one because once that one disappeared, there was no external structure to my own search. So it was really hard to let go of it. But I suppose at some unconscious level I already had. So I'm thinking about all of this in this very unique and bizarre setting. And the Dalai Lama comes out of the recording studio and walks, beautiful sunny day, walks down the path, and there are all these people handing him white silk scarves, and he's passing the scarves on to his entourage and, you know, sort of doesn't actually shake hands, but he's nodding and being friendly. And he gets to me and we make eye contact and he pauses with a frown. And then he bursts into this beatific smile and says, "Oh, murder could be a moral act." And walks on down the line. Darshan from the Dalai Lama in this. And I thought, well, shit. Okay. I'm going to have to reevaluate all that stuff that the Tibetan Buddhists have written. They can actually do this. This stuff they talk about being able to do, they can actually do it. And one sort of side effect of that was realizing, yeah, it is a moral responsibility to take on the reality that murder could be a moral act. And from that point, what passes for prayer in my life has been and continues to be, save me from situations where that is true.
Mm.
May I never be in a position where I have to act on that knowledge. But I can't deny that the knowledge isn't there anymore. After that moment, I couldn't deny it.
Yeah. Boy, that moment is like a living dream. It's like a moment of revelation that's bigger than your psyche could hold.
Indeed. And in some sense, I'm still trying to incorporate all of that. And there was a lovely follow-up to it all. the Dalai Lama was here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of the things he did, I think it was the same day, was to go over to the Steinhardt Aquarium, and he met penguins for the first time in his life. He'd never met any live penguins before, and he was so taken with them that he climbed over the barrier and waded into their little penguin pond, and they all gathered around him. And he had this conversation with the penguins, which, of course, the local news media just loved it. So there was every
shot with penguins
pictures of the Dalai Lama embracing the penguins.
Yeah.
And one of them actually included a moment of talking to one of the penguin caretakers from the Steinhardt, saying, I almost grabbed him and stopped him. These birds are vicious. I've never seen them crowd cheerfully around anybody like this. They even attack me when I go in to feed them.
My goodness.
But they somehow didn't. He was supposed to do a great big ceremony the next day. I believe it was a Kali Chakra initiation, and he got sick, and he didn't do it. And there were all these people who'd bought all these tickets, and there was a lot of hoo-ha about it all. And I was flooded with people dreaming that they were at the ceremony that did not happen.
It happened.
My other DreamWork colleagues reported the same thing, that day when he was supposed to do that, a significant portion of the prospective audience dreamed that it was being done in the dream world.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have thought, well, that's just high-level anticipation that caused that to happen. But after the experience I had, I thought, no, it is more a superstitious act to diminish it all into, well, everybody was disappointed, and so the dreams compensated for the disappointment. That night was one, well, that the following weeks when I heard all these dreams was one of the first moments where I thought to myself, this really was, I think, a gathering.
Wow.
Gathering at another plane.
And it happened.
It
actually still happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that in some sense, it was always happening before we got to it.
Uh-huh.
And it continues to happen, even though in the clock and calendar world we've gone past it.
And it's happening now.
And one of my speaking it out loud makes it not secret prayers is that this little gathering will be energized by these larger gatherings.
Uh-huh.
I would be very happy if that turned out to be true.
Jeremy, how are you preparing for old age and death? How do you prepare for that as a dream worker? I'm
not preparing for old age. It has overtaken me.
Well, you don't seem old to me. You seem like you're vital.
Well, thank you. I don't think old age and vitality are necessarily separate issues.
No, I agree.
I have given up flying on airplanes. I'm immensely grateful to be able to meet with you all this way, rather than having you all gather in one place and me take an airplane.
Mm-hmm.
This is so much easier on my body. The other piece, the hardest thing I find about my own aging process is the difficulty I have taking heart, staying open-minded and open-hearted and able to love and be loved in the face of massive stupidity. I used to think the hardest thing to do was to love our enemies. I used to think, whoa, that's really quite a thing to do. And it's another one of the reasons why I became a dream worker, because the only practical way I have discovered to find love in my heart and mind and psyche for people who really are my enemies, people who, if they weren't restrained, would do me and my family serious harm, is to work dreams with them. It's one of the reasons for my prison ministry. What is even harder for me is to suffer fools gladly. Even though their dreams are marvelous. One of my definitions is that a fool is someone who has a magnificent dream and thinks it's meaningless and doesn't even want to talk about it. That is high-level foolishness. And without the medium of the dream, it is very hard for me to suffer fools gladly. And I don't say it proudly. I see it as a failing.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ironies of old age is that old age seems to put me in the company of fools more often. Maybe it's just I've changed, but it does seem to happen way more often than it used to.
Oh, man.
And I take it as an indication, well, you want to know what your task is?
Yeah.
This is what it is.
The work always continues.
Presenting it to me.
Yeah, yeah. Before we stop, is there anything else you would like us to, you would want us to go away with from this before we open it up to questions?
Oh, just gratitude. It's one of the ways I end dream circles is that I encourage everybody to get up and hold hands, right palm down, left palm up. And I say, I have it on good authority from Meister Eckhart and Black Elk and the current Dalai Lama, who I don't think, with the possible exception of the Dalai Lama, were aware of each other. And they all have said the same thing, that if the only prayer you ever uttered was thank you, it would be enough.
Well, thank you, Jeremy.
Oh, well, thank you all.